Welcome everyone. We're here today to talk about Key Concept 3.1, and we are essentially going to focus on the impact of the French and Indian War. So feel free to take a second and pause the video and read the key concept, but this is what the College Board expects you to know. So I'll give you a second to pause and read it. Alright, so here's a little graphic organizer that's going to kind of keep us on track today. But essentially, we want to look at how the French Indian War led to basically more conflict in North America and also in Europe. Okay, so we're going to focus briefly on the impact it had on Native Americans. Okay, and how that led to conflict. Obviously, the biggie and where we're going to hang out the most today is the French Indian War led to essentially the British taxing the colonies, which led to resentment, which led to violence, which eventually led to independence. Okay, and then once the United States is indeed independent, we come into more conflict with Europe, pretty much because the French Revolution is going on. So the French Indian War is kind of the thing that kind of starts the whole dominoes falling here. So that'll be our focus for today. Okay, sorry about how this slide looks. It kind of cuts off the title. I don't know why it's doing that. But anyways, one of the first things we want to look at is what is the impact of the French Indian War on Native Americans in North America? And unfortunately, and kind of a theme going here, is not a good impact. The loss of the French and Spanish in the continental United States is a major blow to Native Americans. The French and the Spanish, for the most part, were very good allies. To Native Americans. Native Americans are able to kind of use the French as a shield against the British and the Americans, or the American colonists. Because once again, we got to remember that the French were in North America primarily for furs. They weren't really there for creating large-scale settlements and agricultural communities, which meant for the most part the French and Spanish didn't really butt heads too much with the natives like the English did, because the English were constantly looking to expand into the interior of the continent for more farmland, and that obviously brought them into more conflict with the Native Americans. So, anyways, when the French Indian War is over and the French have been, for the most part, been removed from North America, the Native Americans, led by Pontiac, basically rebel in 1763. Okay, they're basically attacking British forts throughout the Ohio Valley. Thousands and thousands of American colonists are killed. Retaliation obviously takes place, and then thousands of Native Americans are killed. So it's a very much a brutal war, but it's pretty much an uprising by the Native Americans who now feel a little bit uncertain about what their situation is now like now that they've lost the French. And so they're pretty much trying to fight for the preservation of their land as they see it. Okay, the British are kind of like, you know what, we don't need this right now. We just got done fighting, the 7 Years' War, which took place both in Europe and obviously in the Americas, and they just don't need it. They're in debt. They don't want to have to deal with this anymore, and so the British basically say to the Native Americans, "Look, we're going to basically make this proclamation, and we're going to bar any colonial settlement west of the Appalachians." So they're basically saying to the natives in that area, "Look, we're not gonna let our people come out there. Let's kind of stop all this violence." Okay. Now, by doing that, yes, it's gonna pacify the Native Americans in that region, but it's also gonna anger the colonists. The colonists basically fought this war to get that land, and so the colonists are very much gonna feel betrayed by this act, and for the most part, they're going to ignore it and settle it anyways. And so the conflict between American settlers and Native Americans is going to continue to intensify throughout the late 18th century. Okay, we can see this intensifying during the Revolutionary War. Washington actually is known as the town destroyer to the Iroquois. He sent his general, one of his generals, General Sullivan, to pretty much take out the Iroquois because the Iroquois were allied to the British during the Revolutionary War. And so here we see an impact of the French Indian War. Obviously, it leads to the American Revolution, and during the American Revolution, the Six Nations, for the most part, their political power is obliterated during this conflict. Okay, so obviously the loss of allies is not a good thing for the Native Americans in this region. Okay, but like I said, the larger thing we want to look at, and our big focus for today, is the impact of the French Indian War is really the British debt essentially doubles. Okay, and because it doubles, the British are going to essentially need to make their new empire pay. Okay, they spent all this money getting this cool empire that looks really cool on a map. It looks like they have all this territory, but the bottom line is they spent a lot of money to get this empire, and so now they essentially need to crack the whip here on their colonies and make their colonies become profitable for them. Okay, so we're going to see this period where there's going to be this end of salutary neglect, where before the British were kind of like, you know what, colonies, just kind of run your own show. We really don't care. As long as we're getting our raw materials, whatever. But here we see, starting in 1763, this pivotal year, the British are going to start cracking down on the colonies, taking over more control, governing them more closely, making sure that they're, getting every penny out of the colonies. Okay? So, obviously, this is going to anger many of the American colonists. They've been used to kind of governing themselves, and now that's going to be cracked down a little bit. They've been used to smuggling, especially in New England, where they smuggled a lot of molasses in to make rum. Now that's going to be cracked down on. A lot of the western farmers and southern planters are very much looking forward to getting all this new land west of the Appalachians, and now that's been cracked down on. Okay, so essentially what we're seeing here is the British are cracking down on the colonists because once again they need to make money off this giant empire that they now have. Okay, and so here we see almost immediately after the French Indian War is over, we see Prime Minister Grenville start to put reforms into place to make the colonies more profitable for the British. Okay, and the ones that I'm going to focus on here the most are the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act. Basically, what does the Sugar Act do? It's trying to raise revenue by taxing molasses. Now, this replaces the Molasses Act previously. The Molasses Act previously was more part of the mercantilist system where it pretty much put this huge tax on French molasses so that the Americans wouldn't trade with the French. Now what the British are saying is, you know what, all this did was pretty much encourage the colonists to smuggle. So what the British are going to do with the Sugar Act is they're going to put a very reasonable tax on molasses. It's not going to be crazy high. It's not going to be crazy low. They see it as being a very reasonable tax. And so from the British perspective, the New Englanders can stop smuggling now, and they can essentially do a little bit to help the British Empire in the Americas. The other big thing that's going to irritate the Americans about the Sugar Act is it's going to basically try all smugglers in vice admiralty courts, meaning that they won't be tried by their peers. They'll be tried by British appointed judges. And the colonists are going to see this as an attack on their God-given rights. Stamp Act, everyone knows what the Stamp Act is, right? It's a tax put on paper. It pretty much affects really only the wealthy because it's pretty much only on official paper. So whenever you're using official paper, you have to have paper that has a stamp on it to prove that you paid a tax. So this is going to really annoy, a lot of the merchants, a lot of the lawyers, the people that do a lot of business with official paper. Okay, and once again, this is going to bring up this whole issue of representation or taxation without representation, which once again is going to be kind of seen as an attack on the colonists' God-given rights. Okay. So anyways, when we look at, I've kind of talking about a lot of these God-given rights, and if we look at this page here, it kind of gives us some examples or some good evidence here of where does this idea of resisting all of these British policies come from, okay? And what I want to focus on real quick is the Enlightenment, okay? The British had allowed free press starting, I think, around 1700, and as a result of that, all these new Enlightenment ideas come across the Atlantic Ocean, these ideas of life and liberty and property, and that people have a God-given right to these things, and government can't take those from you. And so when the colonists start to read these things, they start to believe these things, and then when the British try to take these things away from them, they are very much offended and angered by these actions. Okay? So pretty much right after these taxes go into place, we see the American colonists begin to protest the British actions, okay? And for the most part, some of the earlier protests are very non-violent. You do have some violence sprinkled in there, but for the most part, it's non-violent. In Virginia, their legislature condemns the actions, and this is where we have Patrick Henry's, very famous "Give me liberty" or "Give me death" speech. We also have the non-violent approach of the Stamp Act Congress, where 9 colonies meet to protest the loss of American rights and liberties. And we also see one of the very first boycotts of British goods be put into place, and we will see that those are very effective, these nonviolent approaches to getting the Americans what they want. Because eventually it does, all these things do lead to the repeal of the Stamp Act in 1766. The British pretty much repeal the Stamp Act because it's not making them any money, okay? Because the tax isn't being really collected because of the boycotts and because of some of the violence and intimidation methods used by the Sons of Liberty and Sam Adams. And so the British are like, you know what, this isn't worth it. We're not making any money, and we're creating, social discord in the colonies. So it's pretty much a double whammy. And they repeal the Stamp Act, okay? But they're not going to give up so easy, okay? And the next prime minister, he's also going to try to institute a bunch of taxes on the colonies, okay? And once again, it's going to have kind of the same impact. The Americans are just not going to accept these taxes. They philosophically disagree with them, or practically, or maybe they're just greedy, they don't want to pay taxes, who knows? But they're going to resist these, okay? So once again, these new rounds of taxes put in place by Prime Minister Townshend lead to the following things. We have the committees of correspondence, where basically each colony sets up this committee, and they basically start to communicate with each other and start to kind of strategize what they should be doing. So the colonies begin to communicate with each other and become more cohesive as a collective whole instead of just being these separate individual little states. Okay. We also see a massive boycott be put into place where many Americans, and once again, not all Americans, begin to boycott British goods, and this becomes incredibly effective for the Americans in kind of getting their point across. And another nasty effect we see of the Townshend Acts is that it does lead to violence and bloodshed, especially in Boston, which is kind of like the beating heart of the American Revolution here. The Bostonians just openly disobeyed British law. They're smuggling in the wide open. They're not paying taxes. They're boycotting. They have all this, really controversial rhetoric they're throwing out there. And so eventually we do see violence taking place in Boston. We have the Boston Massacre in 1770. And then tensions remain high, and we have the Tea Party in 1773. And the Boston Tea Party is very significant because the Boston Tea Party kind of is the last straw for the British. And the British then passed the Coercive Acts, known as the Intolerable Acts in America. And what the Intolerable Acts do is it pretty much puts martial law down in Boston. So it closes the port, they ban town hall meetings, only British judges are allowed to try cases, and also it sends more troops into Boston. And so now we're kind of in this very dangerous place now where you have more troops in Boston, tensions are running high, and it's just really not a good situation. So while this is going on, we have our first Continental Congress gets called together, and this is an illegal body. The colonies weren't supposed to be doing this, but all the colonies join up here, and at this point, no one's talking independence, but what they do want is they want to kind of pump the brakes here on what's been going down in the last couple of years. And so the Continental Congress, basically, they declare their rights, the rights that they perceive that they have, the rights that they feel are being trampled on by the British. They send a plea to the king, King George, and they're saying, hey, come on now, let's work this out. Please, kind of meet our demands here. And they also organize the association, which is this massive boycott of British goods. And so once again, we're starting to see the colonies kind of unite here. Okay, so we're inching closer and closer to violence and independence here. Eventually, we do see kind of law and order breaking down, specifically in Massachusetts. We see that in the countryside outside of Boston, the British effectively lose the ability to rule and govern. British officials are sent out of that region. In rural Massachusetts, right outside of Boston, weapons start to be gathered, militias start to form, and they're training wide out in the open. And so it becomes very clear to the British that they're in this very, very difficult situation where the Massachusetts people have pretty much rebelled against their rule, that the British really don't have any control in Massachusetts outside of Boston. And so the British decide to take a pretty bold move. And that bold move is to send troops out into rural Massachusetts to go after the ringleaders, Sam Adams and John Hancock, and also to seize some of the rebel munitions that the rebels have began to essentially collect. And this is where we see the first battles of the Revolutionary War starting. We have Lexington and we have Concord. Okay, and these battles are significant purely because they're the first real organized fighting that takes place. Obviously, there was violence before with the massacre in Boston in 1770, but here we see American Minutemen militia fighting against the Redcoats. Okay, so here we see the violence starting. Okay, so the war is on. It's still once again not clear that there's going to be a Declaration of Independence because remember, for throughout most of 1775 and early of 1776, independence is not really talked about much. So reconciliation is still very much the goal here. The other thing we have to really understand about the 13 colonies at this point is that the American Revolution is not this, universal accepted course of action. Many people do not want to rebel against the British. In fact, as many as one third of the American colonists, and once again, we're pretty much ignoring, African Americans and Native Americans here, but one third don't want to break away from the British. In fact, if you look at New York and the Carolinas and Georgia, you see regions of the 13 colonies that are very much pro-British. They remain loyal to the king. In fact, some even fight against their brethren, their patriot brethren. And while majority of the Americans did want independence, it wasn't like it was a huge majority. I would call it a very soft two-thirds. And if you look at where the patriot strongholds, it's pretty much New England and Virginia. That's where you see the hardcore zealots here that pretty much hate Great Britain. They hate the loyalists, and they're the ones that are going to be the driving force behind this revolution. Okay? When you look at the strengths and weaknesses of the opposing sides, it's really quite impressive that the Americans were, able to even win this. I mean, the British, on paper, were clearly the stronger opponent. And the American Revolution is a great example where the weaker nation actually wins. You look on paper, it doesn't seem like the Americans have really any hope at all against, a wealthy superpower like the British were. I mean, the British were the strongest nation of the world at that time. They had the most professional army. They had the largest navy. They were incredibly wealthy. They were industrializing. I mean, they had all these things going for them. They had thousands of loyalists in the colonies that were supporting them. So it looks like they should have won. So I guess the question is, why didn't they? And I guess when you look at American strengths, we have some pretty important strengths. Number one, we have some pretty amazing leaders. George Washington, while he doesn't win many battles, in fact, he loses most of his battles, he's a very inspirational leader, and he understands what he has to do. And what he understands he has to do is not get crushed. And so, if the American army is going to fight a battle, he better make sure he knows how to make sure that they can retreat and not get completely destroyed in that battle, which is what he's really good at. We're able to, get a lot of European recruits to come and help us, like Lafayette and von Steuben, and these guys are instrumental in making our army a little bit more professional. But I think most importantly, what we're able to do is we're able to secure allies. And without the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch, but mainly the French, without the French, we don't probably win this war. We probably lose the war, and who knows what happens after that. But we really have to give some mad props here to the French, because without them, we probably don't win. So, anyways, once we do win the war, more conflict happens. We have to figure out what is our place in this world. And as a result of our revolution, there's the French Revolution. The French, I think it was something crazy like their debt exploded 6 times or something because of the American Revolution, because all the money they borrowed us and all the military they sent over to help us. The French were in pretty rough shape, and a lot of people say the French people were inspired by us to go after their own kind of democratic dreams, I suppose. And so here we see the United States, shortly after gaining our own independence, we're now in this awkward situation with the French Revolution. And the French Revolution is going to create further conflict in Europe, but also in the Americas. It's going to lead, in fact, even political parties being formed, in the United States. And that's something that is very much disappointing to Washington, who in his farewell address says, you know what, we shouldn't be dividing ourselves by regions or by political parties. And he very much promotes this idea of isolationism, that we should be a country that minds its own business, and that we shouldn't get involved in European conflicts. And Washington is actually, in that sense, um, people really kind of follow his example. Obviously, we don't avoid sectionalism and we don't avoid political parties, but we definitely do stay out of people's business throughout much of our history. So, anyways, that's all I have for today, guys. I hope this kind of helped you wade through key concept 3.1. Thanks.